part of Canada's social revolution can be witnessed in its extreme new euthanasia laws. In 2016, Justin Trudeau's government passed legislation enabling assisted suicide for terminally ill Canadians. To find out more, I travelled to Montreal to meet with Christine. Christine, thank you so much for allowing us into your beautiful home. Why don't you tell me a bit about your story, your background?
I served 10 years in regular force, Canadian Armed Forces and artillery. I soon early got injured training. When I jumped into a trench, my knee fell out of joint and the spine followed.
Not only were you a veteran, you also became a Paralympian.
About 2008, I was introduced to kayak. It seemed that I showed some talent in it. Or I was approached to try out the sprint kayak, and I did, and became a 5-time world champion.
Wow.
The first thing I remember feeling when I was on the water was this sense of serenity and plenitude that I had not felt for so long. To me, it was as if I just found another way to keep serving my country.
So you've done a lot for your country. How do you feel Canada has treated you in return?
Complete abandonment. There was a time at first when I first became a veteran, the services were a lot better. Since I became a veteran in 1998, the government has gone to sell out or privatize our services. Now it's the second time, and they just done it again now. It took 12 years between renewals of my wheelchairs. We're allowed to have one every 5 years. I don't like to have to ask, it's been 5 years, give me a new one. If it still works, it still works. But 12 years, it's not normal. You know, 7 years after my wheelchair, I asked for the second one, and it took 5 years to get it. This is completely ridiculous. I'm in the works right now waiting for the renewal of an elevator to be able to access outside my house.
Can you tell us what happened when you asked for this? Was it the ramp outside you needed?
Yes. I said, you know, I just can't keep going like this. I can't keep living like this. Like, this has to be done, this has to be resolved. And the person stated, you know, Madame Gauthier, if you really feel you can't go on like this, if you really feel you can't do it anymore, you know you have the right to die. So it's like, wow, I can't believe, you know, after all of this time, not only will you not give me the equipment I need to live, but you will help me die. I have been suicidal and in complete desperation for the last 10, 15 years. And suddenly you just come out and tell me, you know, if you really can't go on anymore and you feel you can't do it anymore, you just, you know, you have the right to die. Yeah, it's really hard to understand this when you still are maybe blinded enough or stupid enough to believe and think that your government is there to help you and not to end your life because you're becoming too pricey or too much of a problem.
But presumably you want to live, and this person telling you that you had the right to die must have been one of the most awful things that anyone could tell you after all of the things that you've been through.
Yes, I think that if I want to live. Nobody ever asked me, like, of course if someone asked me, what do you want to do today? Well, if I had the choice, I would want to go and run. I would want to go and do many things. So right now, yes, I would like to be able to live, but with autonomy and dignity, and do things for myself as much as possible.
How many other cases do you think there could be in Canada like yours?
My God, I'm terrified to hear the numbers, because like I said, personally, I didn't even know there were others. Whether you push someone in despair enough for them to commit suicide, which we all know the numbers are astronomical for veteran suicide, or whether they get to have the attention enough to get made, it's not different. It is the same for me, whether you will provide the room to do it or so, or just let them crawl into their own hole and die. What's the difference? For myself, I've had been close many times of committing the act. If it had not been for my mother still there and somehow her calling me at this moment, or for these, my dog coming and sitting littered on me when I was about to do it, whether they were, I don't explain why and how this has happened, but it did. I don't think it's a government's place or an hospital's place to decide, yeah, okay, you're a little depressed this week. Here, sign this paper 3 times. We'll ask you, you sure you want to die? I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong, and I think it's just going to keep drawing this country into a deeper hole.
Not everyone is opposed to the euthanasia laws. I spoke to a clinician who assesses and administers assisted dying.
So most of my career has been with abortion care, women's health, reproductive rights, social justice. And then I've just tried to integrate what I believe in with what's happening on the ground. And so when the legislation came through in assisted dying, it was the same year that we got mifepristone in Canada. So mifepristone is the drug that people can take a tablet for abortion. So my skills and need for doing surgical abortion was limited, and I thought, oh, there's an interesting change in the law happening, which is also about social justice, which is also about a person's autonomy. I wonder if I might like to get involved in that.
In terms of the future of the MAID legislation, there's some interesting developments going on. Can you talk a bit about that?
So what we are anticipating in next March is that the legislation will not have mental illness or mental health disorders as a restriction. If a person's only reason for seeking assisted death is that they have a severe and incurable mental health disorder, then they can consider their application considered to be assessed.
We know from people who attempt to commit suicide, who are depressed or have mental health issues, but who survive, some of them say that they regretted it. You're adding a new layer of controversy, I suppose.
I'm quite reassured that the level of scrutiny and the level of assessment is very tight. I do believe that the clinicians are involving quite a number of consultants to determine eligibility.
Canada has changed a lot in the last few decades. As you mentioned, multiculturalism, all sorts of people's beliefs around religion in particular. From a Christian perspective, suicide is seen as a sin. Do you think that Canada has become a post-Christian nation?
I don't think Canada was ever fully a Christian nation because it has such a strong Indigenous culture, which obviously is not Christian,
of course,
in its core. I agree in many religions that suicide is not considered all right. Having said that, I have dealt with a number of situations in assisted dying where there has been a priest present and we have together formally ended that person's life.
One other area where Canada perhaps shows itself to be unique in the West in terms of issues of morality are these new laws around assisted dying, what they call euphemistically MAID.
Oh yeah. Orwell spitting in his grave.
Do you think that in a Christian nation this would happen? And has Canada become the first real post-Christian nation?
Well, we're not as post-Christian as you can get. But yes, I would say in the West, are we the first one? We're certainly in the front runners. And no, I don't think it would happen in a truly Christian society. And I think Christianity and Judaism, for that matter, and in all likelihood Islam, is actually a bulwark against such things. Because at least you start with the metaphysical presumption, at least in the Judeo-Christian corpus, that there's some, each person carries with them a spark of the divine that the state has no right to interfere with in the least. Quite the contrary, must be respectful of. And independent of that, I also think that if you're the sort of fool who thinks that the government should have the power to aid people in their own death, well, you've got a lot of thinking to do, buddy, because why would you presume that the government is trustworthy enough to do that? I'm an opponent of capital punishment, not because I don't think there are crimes that are sufficiently heinous to deserve death, because there certainly are. And if you don't know that, you don't know anything about crime. And then now we're giving the state that power, well, on compassionate grounds. For
a nation to be truly woke, it must have its own narrative of oppression. In America, activists focus on the country's history of slavery and racist laws. In Britain, they focus on the empire. To try to understand Canada's equivalent narrative, I spoke with David Lees of the Frontier Centre for Public Policy.
Today we're going to be talking about your rights and freedoms.
These woke campaigns, they all have their own narratives and histories and backstories and heroes that they take from history. In Canada, what do they focus on?
Well, in Canada, we don't really have much of a history of slavery at all. So I think that when it comes to our very mixed relationship with Indigenous peoples, the story of our relationship with Indigenous peoples, particularly through residential schools, is a very classic case to be used then as our critical race theory issue.
So in Canada, there is this narrative around what's called the Indigenous genocide. Can you just break that down for a British audience?
In Canada, we have been fed a narrative that we're a genocidal nation. And these are horrific types of claims to make, especially for Canadians, because Canadians deeply care about fellow Canadians and including Indigenous people. Now, there have been historically many examples of poorly thought out and conceived policies against Indigenous people, but it's a narrative that does not do justice to the history. Part of that is through the residential school story, where the country of its day was trying to figure out, well, how do we engage Indigenous people in this new economy? And so education was always seen, as it is today, as a key door opening to integrating people into Canadian society.
Let's talk more about this Kamloops mass grave site. So the Kamloops Band, which is the sort of group of Indigenous people there, they put out a statement a few years ago saying that they'd found this mass grave site and they'd done some scans of the grounds, and they claimed that there were 215 disturbances within the grounds, which they said were evidence of human remains, even children who were basically being killed or wiped out. Is that actually evidence of a genocide? Have they dug up the grounds? Have they found the bodies?
No evidence has been found to date. In fact, the sonar seeking devices are not indications of any grave. To suggest otherwise is utter nonsense. So those claims need to be investigated, like any other claim of a crime scene. They need to be looked at.
As you say, crucially, they haven't actually dug up these sites.
No, they've not been excavated, they've not been exhumed or anything like that. So it has really become a kind of a bizarre type of claim. This is not just simply about the story of residential schools. This is the story of how a nation has, I believe, been infected by a really destructive, hate-filled ideology of wokeism. We are truly the canary in the coal mine when it comes to G7 countries.
So you could actually be facing prison time potentially if you question this Indigenous genocide narrative?
Well, certainly if you listen to the openness of the current Minister of Justice federally, yes, we have a risk that they will seek to criminalize any questioning of the residential school narrative or the claims of mass graves, which is utterly absurd. Part of history, part of science is being open-minded to healthy debate and evidence seeking as we work to find the truth together. That's part of civilization.
Questioning the Indigenous genocide story already has its consequences. One such dissenter is Jim, who I met in his home in Vancouver. So you were a teacher, you're no longer a teacher. Why?
One day 2 years ago, I was teaching Calculus 12 to older students, and news had broken right across the world about 215 children being murdered in an Indian residential school. And I thought, well, that's not really right. That doesn't make sense. Teachers don't murder their own children. It's not good for one's career. It's, but much more seriously, it's it just is such a, you can't bear witness, as Commandment 9 says in the Bible, against your neighbor, bear false testimony without having evidence, without truth. So all I said that day to students, and I was expected to reproduce the narrative about, oh yes, white Christians had just made a mess of Canada and had done so forever, and they were mass murderers now, and And in Canada, the men and women in this particular school in Kamloops, it was Oblate priests and brothers and Sisters of St. Anne. They devoted themselves fully to the education of young people. They came from Europe to do so. The idea that they put children in incinerators or hanged them and secretly buried them at night and all that sort of stuff, is just, why would you say that to students if it's not true? All I said was the kids died from disease, and they did die from disease. Nobody has since questioned. But I was walked out within half an hour of mentioning that one comment, suggesting, I didn't even say it wasn't murder, but the very suggestion that it wasn't genocide. They walked vice principals walked me, frog marched me out of the school, and I haven't been teaching since, and I've been told that I never will.
Do you think that Canada is worse than other nations?
Well, I've heard many people say that it's worse in Canada than elsewhere. We've gone off the rails more than probably anywhere else in the world. And as a teacher, for me to be afraid to tell kids that there's such things as boys and girls, you know it's gone a little bit ridiculous.
To prevent wokeism from spreading, it's important to have a strong opposition party. Canada's Conservatives have been historically weak in pushing back against Trudeau.
So be strong.
Thank you.
Yeah, you want to take a photo?
I'd love to.
To discuss the failure of Canada's Conservatives, I met with the leader of a rival right-wing party, Maxime Bernier.
Thank you.
I'll always fight for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God
Have a
bless
nice
you.
day. Thank you.
Does that happen often?
Yeah, sometime, yeah.
So Maxime,
Yeah.
for British viewers who don't know who you are or what party you founded, can you explain your story?
Yes, I'm Maxime Bernier. I'm the founder of the People's Party of Canada. We created that party in 2018, but before that, I was a conservative. I was elected in 2006, and I was part of the Harper government, the conservative government here in Canada. They don't have any principles. They're just, they try to everything to be elected. And I said, I don't want to be part of that.
But isn't it the case that the Conservatives have a new leader, Pierre Poilievre, who's far more conservative and more on the right than Andrew Scheer or the previous leaders? So he's taking the party more in your direction, I suppose. So what's the point in you in that sense?
But Pierre Poilievre was a real conservative during the leadership contest, because he knew that to be the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, you must speak like a conservative. So he did that. Now his goal, like Andrew Scheer, is to be the Prime Minister. And we know that the big cities are leftists and liberals. So what he's doing is going to the left to be sure to be elected. That's why he's not speaking against mass immigration. That's why, he's okay with the radical gender ideology. That's why Poilievre voted for the Bill C-4. The Bill C-4 in Canada is the bill that criminalizes parents and therapists who want to help gender dysphoria kids. And if you do that, you may go in jail up to 5 years. But that bill also is doing the promotion of the transition. And for me, there's no transition. You have boys and the girls cannot be a boy and a boy cannot be a girl. But for the Conservative, and every member of Parliament voted for that bill, voted for the Bill C-4. So we don't have any opposition in Parliament right now in Ottawa.
So we're next to the statue of John A. Macdonald.
Yeah.
You can't see him.
Yeah.
There's actually a little sign on, he's been boarded up. Why has he been boarded up?
Because of the woke ideology, and they try to impose their history on us, the new vision of this country. But what the first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, did for this country, I believe that is a great history.
So it seems that what's unique to Canada in a way is Trudeau himself as a leader compared to other Western nations, because you could look at the COVID lockdowns or wokeism or whatever, and they apply to lots of Western countries, to most Western countries. But what I'm interested in, I suppose, is what is it about Canada itself that Canada has gone so far to the left? And maybe you disagree that Canada is an outlier compared to other Western nations. You can explain that.
No, I think we've gone further down the woke road than any other place, except perhaps for California. I think part of the reason for that is that we were an early adopter of the doctrines of group rights. The Francophones had rights, the Indigenous people, as as a group had rights. The Anglophones had rights. There were 3 founding peoples, and group and individual rights had to be balanced. And I don't think there is any such thing as group rights, because there's no such thing as group responsibility. So it's a non-starter conceptually. And so in some ways the table was set in Canada for the rise of a more universal doctrine of group identity and group rights. And plus, Canadians pride themselves on, you know, being nice, let's say, and, you know, and not being offensive, and just hoping that everyone will get along. And, you know, there's nothing glorious about incivility, but there's very little to distinguish excessive niceness from weakness. And the problem with being nice, and this is a technical problem because niceness is associated with trait agreeableness, is that agreeable people are cannon fodder for psychopaths. So I don't believe that any of the conundrum that we're in at the moment in the West is strictly political. I think what's happened is that the predatory psychopaths have figured out how to cloak themselves in the guise of compassion.
During my travels, I found ordinary Canadians appalled at their country's surrender to drug dealers, its contempt for freedom of speech, its enforcement of gender ideology on children, and a breezy willingness to terminate the lives of its own citizens. However, for all of the depressing stories of people losing their jobs or being hounded by the government, these cases were equally inspirational. Whilst Canada is a warning to the West, there are also messages of hope from those brave individuals fighting for their freedom.